Trails, the online archaeology forum of the Sharma Center for Heritage Education, India. Brush the dust off long forgotten thoughts. Slice through time and space.
Listen to stories in stone.
Whispers of voices lost in time.
Build bridges across worlds.
Curious minds reach out to the past. And travel down ancient trails.
So welcome everyone, and we are delighted to have you with us, Oliver, and over to you, Paromita and Shutanuka.
Yeah, thank you. Is my screen visible?
Yes, yes.
Okay. So welcome everyone. We are very happy to welcome all of you to the 9th episode of Hard and Hardware series. And today is the 92nd lecture of Down Ancient Trails, which is going to be delivered by Dr. Oliver Harris. Dr. Harris is Associate Professor of Archaeology at the University of Leicester. His research focuses on archaeological theory and the Neolithic and Bronze Age of Britain and Northwest Europe, but also wanders to include long-term landscape history, the emergence of gender, and the roles of non-humans in politics. He is the co-author of The Body in History, Europe from the Paleolithic to the Future, Archaeological Theory in the New Millennium, and Archaeological Theory in Dialogue. He has just finished a book called Assembling Past Worlds. And if I'm not wrong, today also a new publication of him has come out. Congratulations, Dr. Harris, on that. And we'll be very happy to have a copy of that. So today he is going to speak on assembling past worlds, materials, bodies, and architecture in Neolithic Britain. And a detailed abstract of this is also available on our website. We request everyone to go and check there. Before I hand over the screen to the speaker, we request everyone to go and check our YouTube channel, which is in name of Sharma Center for Heritage Education India, where, as you can see, we have already started uploading the Down Ancient Trails talks from even from the year 2020, based on the wishes of the speakers. So the link we can find in the chat box. Please like and subscribe to stay updated. And this talk will be available in our YouTube channel, as Dr. Harris has already given his consent very shortly. So we request all the participants to not to take any recording or screenshots, please. It will soon be available in our YouTube channel. So without taking much time, I'll just stop sharing my screen. And Dr. Harris, I welcome you again, and the stage is yours. So you can start sharing.
Yes.
If you can unmute yourself. Yeah, over to you.
There we go. Thank you. Yes, for a moment, let me unmute myself. Thank you very much indeed for the very kind introduction and for the invitation to speak today. It's an absolute privilege to come and talk. And as I was saying before we admitted the visitors, one of the few bonuses of the strange times in which we live is the ability to come together like this across different continents and talk to each other about archaeology and the things we're all interested in and passionate about. And it's something that I think, I hope will last long after we've put COVID well behind us as a species. We can continue having these conversations in both directions, inviting people from India to come and speak in the UK and vice versa, without having to worry either about the cost or about the damage to the climate that has involved previously. So in today's talk, I want to talk about some of the themes that have been dominating my research over the last few years. And I want to put that in the kind of context of where we are with the Neolithic in Britain in particular. So I think it's been a really exciting period of research in the first period of farming in Britain, the Neolithic, over the last 20 years or so. And today I want to think about that, but also think about maybe where we can push the boundaries of what we're doing a little bit further and take it a little bit further. So in my talk today, what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about the excitement of the British Neolithic at the moment, the dates, some of the new dates, some of the new sites, some of the new science that's being
Oliver, I think we lost you. We lost
Yes,
connection.
yes. We can't hear you.
I'll just email.
Yes.
Just if you can email. I think we have lost him. So give us a minute while we get the speaker back.
He's back. He's trying to join us. Yeah.
Sorry, I got kicked off my internet there. Can you all hear me again?
Yes.
Sorry about that. There you go.
Yeah.
That's the other side, though. That doesn't happen if you're doing these things in
Yeah.
person, I suppose. So
Yeah.
swings around. Let's go back to my. Let me go back to my screen. Never really see that again. Is that on view?
Yes. If
Yeah,
you can
all right. Well,
start from the first slide.
Yeah.
Okay.
And as one of our participants has suggested, maybe if your internet is not stable, if you can switch off your video, that might help.
Yeah, certainly I can do that. Give me one moment. There we go. Hold on, why isn't that? Right. So hopefully we're on the second slide. Is that what you can see now? The kind of one with that says assembly parts world. Brilliant.
Yes.
Okay, sorry about that.
Actually, if you can, your video would be great. If your connection is a bit more stable, because people would like to see you also. But if it's if it's unstable, as Akash has suggested, you can switch it off anytime you feel like.
Okay, we'll see how it goes anyway. Yeah, sorry about that, everybody. There you go. That's 21st century technology for you. Not quite as reliable as you might want it to be. So what I'd like to suggest then is that we, in order to develop these fantastic things that we're learning about from new sites and new dates and those sorts of things, we also need to generate new ideas and new concepts. I need to think about new ways of thinking about the past as well. I think that's really important. So the period I want to talk about today then is the Neolithic of Britain, and that's the kind of first period of farming in this country, which lasts from around for about 2,000 years, starting at around 4,100 BC and finishing around 2,400 BC with the arrival of the first metalworking in the country. It involves the kind of standard elements of the Neolithic package, as we might think of it in Europe, including domesticated cows and sheep and pigs and goats, growing of plants, emmer wheat and barley and things like that. But there's lots of variation in terms of how mobile people are, the kinds of diet they have and those sorts of things. And we generally divide the period into three broad categories: the early, middle and late Neolithic. These are pretty crude and they're not necessarily always helpful. They certainly obscure as much as they reveal, but I think certainly they're things we can kind of keep in mind as we're moving through today's talk. Just to give you some insight into various bits of the material culture, this is the first period in which pottery is used in Britain. There are lots of different types of pottery which change through time, as you can imagine. I won't delay us with concentrating on the different types of pottery we get, and lots of different kinds of flint tools and polished stone axes, which are really, really key. You can see an image of a polished stone axe on the screen here. They're often produced from very particular axe factory sites, which it appears people go to both because of the quality of the stone itself, but also because of the location of those sites. The most famous of them, Langdale in the northwest of England in the Lake District. People obtained a particular form of tough stone that was could have easily been obtained further down the mountain, but they go right to the top of one of the highest peaks in England in order to extract this stone. So there's all sorts of concerns clearly taking place there with the origins of particular kinds of materials. We get kinds of prestige flint work and lots of other kinds of material culture too, querns and beads and jet belt sliders and boar's tusks. And when we have preservation, things made out of wood and bark as well. And of course, I'm sure we're missing all kinds of things in the kind of material culture repertoire of this particular period. We find people living in different kinds of houses in this period. So early on, we get in England and particularly in Scotland, we get large timber halls up to 25 meters in length. You can see a reconstruction of one in the bottom right-hand picture of the screen, a reconstruction of Balbrigdy. These are constructed from around 3800 BC. We also get smaller, what we sometimes call Irish type houses, because they're very common in the Republic of Ireland and in Northern Ireland as well, actually on the Irish island. Less common in England and Wales, so we do find some, including the one at Horton that's in southern England that you can see at the top of the screen there. Different things in the late Neolithic. And in the islands off Britain, we find quite different patterns, particularly in Orkney, which I'm sure you've heard of, very famous for its Neolithic archaeology, including agglomerations of wooden first, and then particularly of stone houses that come together, especially around 3000 BC, where we start seeing several of these rather large stone agglomerations of houses, small villages really, which are very different to what we're seeing elsewhere in the country at that time. So again, a picture of variation at this particular point in time in how people are living and the kinds of houses in which they dwell. The Neolithic's probably most famous for its monuments in Britain. We get incredible tombs up and down the country, especially in the early part of the period, but stretching later in certain areas. We get Causeway Enclosures, which are these big interrupted sequences of ditches that define particular areas where people may have conducted feasting and other ceremonies. In the Middle Neolithic, we get round mounds and cursus monuments, which are these extraordinary sets of parallel ditches that run across the landscape, sometimes for huge distances. The Dorset cursus, which is the longest, runs for 9.8 kilometres across Cranbourne Chase in southern England, 2 ditches 90 metres apart from each other, running for quite extraordinary distances. That's a very long version. Some smaller ones are a few hundred metres, but they really are quite large and interesting monuments. In the late Neolithic, we find henges. These are kind of enclosures, normally with a bank outside the ditch rather than on the inside. Huge mounds being constructed, palisaded enclosures, and stone circles as well, one of which you can see in the corner of the screen here. That's the ring of Brodga in Orkney, one of the more famous stone circles dating to the late Neolithic. Would have been surrounded by an enormous ditch, 3 or 4 meters in depth when it was first cut. So really quite a cut-off monument from the rest of the world in some ways. One of the key patterns for how archaeologists have thought about this period is to think about how people treat their dead through them. And the normal story that we tell changes from an early Neolithic world of collective inhumations in tombs. On the right-hand side, you can see the mortuary chamber of Fussel's Lodge, a Neolithic long barrow constructed around 3650 BC. Where the bodies of people were deposited and then moved around and mixed up, and in fact, in some cases, recombined together. The two at the bottom bone groups, these 2 bone groups at the bottom here, are actually made up of amalgamations of 2 composite individuals put together to make a kind of something that looks like a skeleton of one person, but is actually more than one body put back together. In the Middle Neolithic, we see the emergence of individual burials, often with grave goods. Particularly things like jet belt sliders and polished axes of different kinds and knives, sometimes antler mace heads as well. And the late Neolithic, we tend to see cremations emerging, and on occasions cremation cemeteries. We get lots and lots of cremations turning up in the same place. The most famous example of that might be Stonehenge, which begins life as a cremation cemetery. But we get other examples at Duggleby Howe in Yorkshire, which we'll see later, at Forteviot in Scotland, Dorchester in Oxfordshire in England, and many others in Wales and Scotland as well. The key thing to remember here is that this simple sequence of moving from collective inhumations to individual burials with grave goods to cremations is a huge simplification of the complexity of the real picture. There's some truth to it, but for example, we'll see a site in a little bit that I've excavated, which is an early Neolithic monument, which does have collective inhumations in it, but the very first act at the site is the deposition of a cremation burial. So actually, this sequence is much more complicated, and we get fragmentation and cremation and single inhumation all the way through the Neolithic. But each individual practice waxes and wanes in its popularity as we go. Now, over the last 20 years or so, the kind of the period through which I've been studying the Neolithic, I suppose, we've had absolutely enormous growth in our knowledge, which has been fantastic to see. The whole understanding of the period really has been contributed to by some fantastic new discoveries. And there are 3 I want to flag in the kind of first half of my talk today. The first off are kind of new chronologies that have emerged through Bayesian modeling of radiocarbon dates. I'll talk a little bit more about each of these in a moment, so I'm only going to kind of introduce them here. We've seen new scientific approaches, especially through the use of ancient DNA and isotopic analysis. And we've also seen new excavations and discoveries up and down the country. The first of these, I think, has perhaps been the most influential of any of them, actually, and that's our ability to create increasingly refined radiocarbon chronologies through the use of Bayesian modeling. I'm sure many of you are familiar with Bayesian modeling, but of course what it does is build in prior information, often stratigraphic sequences, into the way in which we model the likely probability distribution of radiocarbon dates, which allows us to really narrow down the sequence of different kinds of monuments in particular, but also whole classes of material culture. This work has been led by my PhD supervisor, Alistair Whittle, and combined particularly with Alex Bayliss and Francis Healy. In 2011, they published a book you can see on the screen here, Gathering Time, that offered an absolutely unparalleled chronology for the Neolithic in the first millennium of its existence in Britain. It's told us that monuments that we thought were in use for centuries were in use for decades, that some monuments were, returned to again and again and again, and others had brief florets of use before fading out of existence. From a very generalized picture of, people sort of do these kinds of things, the work of Alistair, Francis, and Alex has opened up a much more sophisticated understanding of the rhythms of the chronology, particularly in the 4th millennium BC, and there are new projects underway. There's one that's just started by Seren Griffiths and Julian Thomas that's going to do a similar program for the next period, the kind of late Neolithic, which will be fantastic as those dates and modeling of those dates comes to the fore. It's really difficult to express how critical the publication of Gathering Time is as a moment that marks a before and after moment in our understanding of the Neolithic of Britain. And that's not just a kind of the whole period, it's also individual sites, as I was mentioning. One example of that is one of these agglomerated villages I was talking about that we get on Orkney. This is Barnhouse, the image here, courtesy of Colin Richards, who excavated the site. And what we've been able to do using radio, or what people like Colin Richards and Alistair Whittle have been able to do using calibrated models of radiocarbon dates, is to take apart the sequence of a site like this from a series of houses that might have been broadly contemporary, where we could only really see sequence where we got direct stratigraphic relationships, to actually be able to piece apart how this settlement grows and changes from its initial construction around the larger house 2 through to the end of the phase of the settlement where the enormous structure 8 gets constructed that you can see here on the screen in the plan. And this tells us so much more about the rhythms of history and development of individual sites like Barnhouse, but of course these build up to much more complex and nuanced narratives of the histories of archaeology in the Neolithic of Britain. The other two things I'd flag in terms of science have certainly emerged through ancient DNA analysis and isotopic analysis. Ancient DNA has told us a lot about the start of the Neolithic in Britain. It's now very clear that continental people arriving from the continent, from France, but particularly probably, but also potentially from the Low Countries like Belgium and the Netherlands as they are today, played a critical role in the emergence of the Neolithic in Britain. We could also trace, using ancient DNA, relations between people buried in particular monuments. We can see one particular Neolithic monument in Cambridgeshire, 2 brothers being buried in a grave with one another. And we're beginning to see hints of other kinds of ancestry and descent emerging in the chamber tombs of the period. Isotope analysis is allowing us to look at diet, of course, but also again at movement. On the screen here, you'll see the Neolithic Causeway Enclosure of Hambledon Hill, or the kind of the chalk island upon which it was constructed. And this is a site where the work of Samantha Neal and Chris Scarr and Janet Montgomery has revealed the kind of movement of people to and from this site, both locally, but also over much greater distances, has begun to open up the different things that happened to the bodies of the dead who were buried here that came from different places, and how some of them were caught up in violence, for example, in unexpected ways. So again, real details of life emerging, both at individual scales and also across the period as a whole, thanks to these new scientific analyses. And the final one of my kind of strands of real new data that's emerging, of course, is through new excavations. A growth of commercial archaeology run by private companies in advance of development has revealed whole hosts of archaeology we might not previously have found. Timber halls, like I was discussing earlier, this is one from Kent that was discovered in advance of railway construction. It's called Whitehorse Stone. We have new causeway enclosures. We're getting understandings of dense landscape occupation practices with the discovery of large middens being deposited on floodplains. We're getting new histories of monumental landscapes as well. And of course, that's happening both through commercial excavations, but also through the efforts of universities. Just to give a couple of classic examples, this is the Ness of Brodga, right at the heart of Neolithic Orkney. So if you carried on going down the kind of road you can see in the photo here, you'd get to that site, the Ring of Brodga that I showed you a bit earlier on. And if you kind of backed out the back of this photograph, you'd be at Barnhouse, that village that I showed you just a couple of slides ago. So in between two of the most well-known, best studied sites in the whole of Britain, which has seen as much archaeology as anywhere in the world, we've still managed to find a site that is completely unparalleled in the Ness of Brodga, an extraordinary gathering of houses of different styles surrounded by a 10-metre thick wall. And so this is adding to our understanding both of the local landscape, of course, but also how we conceptualize the period. Another classic example of, an extremely well-studied site that we understand so much better because of modern excavation is Stonehenge and its surrounding landscape, where my former lecturer, Mike Parker-Pearson, who taught me how to dig, has been leading a project with many other archaeologists looking at the archaeology of Stonehenge, looking at the landscape in which it's constructed, and looking at the origins of many of the stones. You may well have seen recently that Mike has identified a potential stone circle in West Wales where some of the blue stones, the slightly smaller stones you can see on the screen here, may have been erected prior to their arrival coming down to Stonehenge. Really fascinating story, and we'll come back and talk a little bit more about Stonehenge at the end of the talk today. Now, I don't want to, just going to take a swig of water, dismiss any of the wonderful advances that have come our way thanks to these new excavations, thanks to these new scientific inquiries, thanks to the modelling of radiocarbon dates. All of this is to be welcomed and to be applauded, and is critical to developing the archaeology of the particular period and part of the world which I study, the Neolithic of Britain. But one of the things I want to gently query today is the extent to which this is really transforming what we say about Neolithic Britain. How are our stories changing as the result of these different kinds of discoveries? So take, for example, Causeway Enclosures, these interrupted ditched sites that I was mentioning a little earlier. In particular, my former PhD supervisor, Alistair Whittle, has done so much to transform the chronology of. You can see a set of plans of Causeway Enclosures on the screen here. So when Causeway Enclosures were being written about in the 1980s and the 1990s, they were often talked about as sites of social gathering and competition. We've had them thoroughly redated, and they're now talked about as being sites of individual competition and social aggrandizement. Well, exactly how different are those two narratives then? How much what are we saying about Causeway Enclosures that's really different? We might be talking about the when of Causeway Enclosures very differently, but are we talking about the why of Causeway Enclosures that differently? I'm not sure that we are necessarily, and we've had 30 or 40 years where maybe some of the same narratives are coming back into force again. Similarly, here's a quote from a very recent paper on ancient DNA studies looking at the arrival of Neolithic people from the continent at the start of the Neolithic in Britain. And Selina Brace et al. Say, a large seaborne movement of established Neolithic groups leading to the rapid establishment of the first agrarian and pastoral economies across Britain provides a plausible scenario for the scale of change in Britain. I mean, this may be true, but that's pretty much what Gordon Childe was saying in the 1930s. So exactly what has ADNA told us then? It may have settled some arguments, but what new questions is it asking? How is it transforming our narratives of the period? How is it opening up new vistas for investigation? Is it just answering questions we've had for 100 years or so in this particular thing? I'm not, of course, against answering those old questions, but is that really all we're limited to as archaeologists? And similarly, let's go back to Stonehenge again. We know enormous amounts more about Stonehenge than we did 20 years ago. In 1998, Mike Parker-Pearson and Ramili Sonina, the Malagasy archaeologist, published the famous paper Stonehenge for the Ancestors. 20 years later, 23 years later, the first volume comes out of Mike's excavations, and it's Stonehenge for the Ancestors. So how much of all of those excavations shifted our basic narrative of this? They've confirmed lots of the ideas that Mike had, but have they really added or transformed what we've said? What new questions are we asking? The way in which Stonehenge is seen as so critical to the Neolithic of Britain has been written about recently by Gordon Berkeley and Kenneth Brophy as a kind of late Neolithic mythos, the notion that perhaps Britain somehow became united at the great site of Stonehenge 4,500 years ago. And Berkeley and Brophy really critique and open up the problems with that idea in their recent paper in the Archaeological Journal that I think is really worth taking seriously. Again, fantastic new discoveries, fantastic new excavations, but where's the transformative new narratives coming from? How can we ask new questions with all of this new wonderful data that we have? So my contention then, both here and in the book that I've recently finished, is that new data by themselves don't mean new questions or necessarily new answers or new narratives. And so we have to take all of this fantastic new information and try and think about it differently, as well as just simply recording it. So how can we do that? Well, in what's left of my talk today, so in the next, let me see, next 20 minutes or so, I want to explore some of the ways in which we might ask new questions of this fantastic new information that we're getting. And I'm going to limit myself just to talking about monuments. I think we can do this with materials. I think we can do it with the way people treated their dead. But I'm going to contain myself just thinking about monuments like this fantastic Portal Dolmen Arthur's Stone from the Gower Peninsula in southwest Wales, a place very dear to my heart. I used to go on holiday here a lot when I was a small child. It might be where my love of the Neolithic started. My mum grew up about 20 miles to the east of where this site is. What happens when we start trying to use new ways of thinking to ask new kinds of questions? And I think archaeologists working in the Neolithic are starting to do that. They're starting to think about monuments differently, monuments playing a much more active role themselves in the creation of Neolithic worlds. And we might think provocatively then of Neolithic monuments as machines for world building. How can we do that? Well, I want to explore that through a quick discussion of three particular sites. I'm going to start off, one's kind of early Neolithic, middle Neolithic, and late Neolithic to give us a spread across the period. I'm going to start off with Clad Aindris, which is a site that I've and my team have excavated on the west coast of Scotland. I then want to talk about Duggleby Howe, which was a site excavated in the 19th century, but has been regularly returned to and restudied, most recently by Alex Gibson and Alex Bayliss, but also by Roy Loveday, critically a great friend of mine and one of the great masters of the British Neolithic. And I'm also going to talk about Stonehenge, because it's always great to talk about Stonehenge, isn't it? Who doesn't love a bit of Stonehenge in a talk? And I have things to say about it. So let's go to the most beautiful part of Britain then, and that's the west coast of Scotland, and to Clad Aindris, the chambered tomb that I and my team have excavated. I should flag up this project is co-directed with Hannah Cobb of the University of Manchester and Phil Richardson of Archaeology Scotland, a charity working out of Edinburgh. And the three of us have been working in this part of Scotland for 15 years now, not just on this site, but on a range of sites on the peninsula. So here's a kind of plan of the site. It's a 60-meter long Neolithic chambered tomb, which features a kind of burial chamber at the front that you could see just kind of close-up photograph on the previous slide. And we've excavated a whole range of trenches at the site. And it's a site with a very long and complicated history that extends through the Bronze Age, into the Iron Age, into the Viking period, into the post-medieval period. It's just the Neolithic phase I want to concentrate on today. The story of the site begins with a cremation burial, which I mentioned to you earlier, perhaps between 3783 and 3656 BC. And immediately on top of that, a round cairn of stones was constructed, around 14 or 15 meters in diameter. Within that, a single chamber was constructed that you can see on the screen here. And within that, many bodies of the dead were placed. It's very difficult to know how many exactly. We have a minimum number of individuals of around 4, but it's worth flagging that the bodies in here are incredibly broken up and churned up. So that probably really underestimates the total number of people placed in this grave. The initial modelling suggests that the site was in use for the site was constructed rather between 3800 and 3680 BC, and was used for about perhaps 200 years or so around that kind of period, with bodies going into it. At that stage, the site is kind of left alone for a while, although it has a long and complicated history that flows on after that. For example, the longer tail, I mentioned it's a 60-meter long monument, but that first construction is perhaps only 14 or 15 meters in diameter, gets added on, changing it from a circular cairn to a long cairn. A ditch is dug around the front of the monument, and perhaps at about the same time, and we have a date for that ditch digging of around 3500 BC or so. We've got Neolithic pottery and material culture from the base of that ditch. So what we take from this then is not just this is telling us about when people arrived or the fact they built a tomb. We can actually start thinking about that architectural sequence quite differently, I suggest, if we start approaching the past from directions that emphasize the importance of materials, the importance of non-humans, the kind of way in which the past emerges out of the efforts of all kinds of beings, including humans, but not just limited to that. Often the way in which archaeologists have written about monuments is they emerge as like a singular design that someone has, or a long barrow should look like this, or a megalithic tomb should look like that. But what we see at a site like Cladangris, and what archaeologists like Leslie McFadden have been trying to teach us for some time, is that that's really not how this kind of building works. Instead, what we see is a monument that's actually shifting and changing and altering all the time. People are gathering materials to this site, human bodies, animal bodies, stones, earth, bringing them together, piling them up, and then stones are falling and moving, and people are adding tails and digging ditches and piling up earth and changing it again. Some of these transformations involve human beings, but many of the collapse of stones or the growth of grass over the top of it don't necessarily. These monuments aren't just happening once, then they're not just built and constructed. The archaeologists have tended to privilege that moment of construction. When was it built? But actually, monuments emerge by being dug and redug and happening again and again. They're not something that just stay the same. They're actually things that shift and change. And perhaps their power and their endurance, their duration, to quote the French philosopher Bergson, emerges from that ability to happen again and again. We can take that to our second site, Duggleby Howe. This is a Middle Neolithic burial excavated by Mortimer in 1890. That's what it looks like today. And this is a kind of the section of the mound that Mortimer drew of his excavations. You can tell this is a kind of classic antiquarian site. What we have here is a kind of central grave pit, or grave B, which is the first one, in which a sequence of burials were placed, individual burials, mostly whole bodies, often with a range of grave goods. There's polished adzes, an antler mace head, there are fine arrowheads, boar's tusks. One of the burials is buried with a separate human skull. And these take place over quite a long time, a number of centuries actually, and told. There's a fantastic specific dating of it now by Alex Bayliss and Alex Gibson, which gives us a kind of real sense of the sequence here. And then there are later burials. A second grave is dug, that grave A, which is later. And then a mound is raised over the top. And later on, 53 cremations are built into that mound. And they're almost certainly late Neolithics after the kind of central burial here. Now, the way in which a site like Duggleby Howe has traditionally been talked about is that these must be very powerful people. These must be very important people. And we know that because they're buried with fantastic, rich and prestigious grave goods. Now, this isn't one of the grave goods from Duggleby Howe. I didn't have a nice photo of any of the grave goods from that. But this is similar to one of the grave goods from Duggleby Howe. It's an antler mace head that dates to about the same period. This is the Garboldisham mace head, a beautifully decorated antler mace head. Now, people have taken these individuals buried with grave goods to be extremely powerful individuals because they're buried with very high prestige tools like these. And we know these tools are very high prestige ones because they're buried with powerful people. So suddenly you might notice that's a little bit of a circular argument. High prestige artifacts are prestigious because they're buried with high prestige people who we know are high prestige because they're buried with high prestige artifacts. As Andy Jones and Marta Diaz-Guadagnino have pointed out, it is really, really circular. And objects like the Garboldisham mace head and other prestige goods, as we've called them, from the Middle Neolithic, actually, and the Late Neolithic as well, are actually often really hastily produced. They're often almost unfinished, and they're often deposited and put away either into rivers or into burials very soon after they've been made. So rather than great heirlooms and symbols of power, these are particular acts of production, moments where things are produced into the world. So we can take this and we can take that notion of the gathering and reoccurrence of monuments that I was speaking about a moment ago to maybe try and think about power a bit differently at a site like Duggleby Howe. Can we think about how power emerges from the intersection of the different kinds of relationships that we see at the site? Can we think about power becoming emergent through the ways these things are gathered together? We know from isotopic analysis that some of the people buried at Duggleby Howe may have grown up quite a long way away, certainly off the chalk geology where Duggleby itself is, and maybe as far afield as Denmark or even northern France. It's been gathering people to it, therefore, gathering materials and gathering these objects. To what extent can we think of power here as emerging in this place? Not that powerful people come here, but the place itself calls that power into being through the way in which it gathers things to it. This suggests, I think, quite a different vision of the power and authority that existed in Middle Neolithic societies than we've previously written about, but it draws very much on the Bayesian analysis, the isotope analysis, the cutting-edge analysis of material culture that allows that argument to come together. So let's finish with my last and final example then by returning to Stonehenge and saying, well, what could we say that's maybe a bit different about Stonehenge than most people are writing about it? Well, Mike would always say that Stonehenge is for the ancestors, but I'm not necessarily interested in disagreeing with that point. But what I want to think about is what happens if we refocused our questions and said, what about Stonehenge for the materials? What would taking that as our starting point add to our narratives and add to the kinds of questions we ask? So a lot of the work at Stonehenge has talked about materials quite a great deal. I mentioned earlier Mike's recent work looking at the origin of the bluestones, tracing not only the quarries in West Wales from where they were mined, but also potentially, and this is one of the bluestones you can see kind of standing up at an angle on the screen here, but also potentially having been erected first in a stone circle in just near, very close to Pembrokeshire, and then perhaps being erected in another stone circle at the river bottom, West Amesbury, or sometimes called Blue Stonehenge, not far from Stonehenge itself, and then being gathered back to the site itself. Mike's argued that the bluestones, many of the bluestones at Stonehenge, though not all of them, date to the very start of the monument's construction, being built in a kind of a circle around the outside of the monument before getting reincorporated into the more famous construction in the middle that we see today. Now, I applaud and welcome this kind of close study of the materials that have been happening by Mike and his team, drawing on geological studies and all kinds of things. But I wonder what would happen if we even put the materials further forward in our narratives, if we stress them to an even greater extent. What would happen if we thought about materials as historical actors themselves? Well, from this perspective, I think we can think about those journeys the stones made as even more important, if anything. We can think about those stones themselves as calling people to them, calling people to West Wales, calling people to drag them across the landscape. We can think about the stories they tell us, something that was actually mentioned in the video at the start of this talk. We can think about the qualities of these stones in different kinds of ways. We can think about the act of dressing some of the blue stones and all of the sarsen, almost all of the sarsen stones at Stonehenge as ways that engage with and alter the histories and stories and the individuality of different ones of these stones that are there, perhaps sometimes denying or suppressing those differences. We can also think about the relationships between things like stone and wood. Stone and wood are often opposed in the Stonehenge landscape. Mike Parker Pearson's first great entry into this debate was to declare that stone was for the dead and wood was for the living, because wood rots and it's organic and stone always stays the same. And stone is everlasting and enduring. And the great timber circles that we see nearby at Durrington Walls and at Woodhenge were contrasted with the stone circle of Stonehenge. But then you look at the architecture of Stonehenge itself, and you look at the fact that you can just see on the left-hand side part of a mortise and tenon joint sticking up from one of the trilithons there. The ability of Stonehenge to stay upright with those extraordinary trilithons rests entirely on the imposition of woodworking techniques onto stone. The stone has to become like wood to last. It's not the case that wood is short-lived and stone is long-lived. It's the case that stone has to become a bit like wood, or a kind of wood, in order to stand up in this way for thousands and thousands of years. When we think about the complexity of these materials, it also takes us out any notion, once again, that Stonehenge has a singular idea or a singular meaning or a singular origin. This was a site that was worked and reworked at least over the first 1500 years of its life, from the 3000 BC until the Middle Bronze Age. And of course, we've gone back to it and engaged with it ourselves again and again and again. Now, the materials are the things that stay throughout all this. Meanings come and go, people come and go. But the sarcens are there, the blue stones are there, the chalk is there, the bone is there, the antler picks are there. It's these materials that give history to Stonehenge and have played such a critical role in its emergence. And there's much more I think we can do to bring those to the fore. So I think in thinking about monuments differently, we can start thinking about the way in which monuments moved people, that they drew people to them at Duggelby Howe. But we can also think about how monuments moved places. Is it simply the case that the stones are moved from West Wales to Stonehenge? Or is it actually the place itself is transformed in that moment? When we think about the connections in the stones themselves, almost the memories encoded in a monument like that, these bend and fold the geography of Britain as we know it, moving them from place to place, monuments that move places, that make places in particular kinds of ways. They become places of power, congealed and held in their materials, if only temporarily, through the way in which these acts are gathering and take place. And these monuments emerge with that power because they persist, they endure, and they endure through happening again and again and again, through the moments they emerge and through the moments they change. So what I've tried to argue here then is that monuments are complex actors in Neolithic Britain. They're not merely the products of the plans of individuals, the outcome of social competition or of people's hierarchies or of particular traditions of practice even. That they're actually much more active than that they're playing critical roles in the emergence of Neolithic Britain. And I think we can think about human bodies, we can think about death and burial rituals, we can think about materials and material culture in similar kinds of ways, as I touched on a little bit with the Garbaldisham mace head. I think we can start thinking about these new ways of conceptualizing materials and past worlds alongside the Bayesian analysis of radiocarbon dates, of ancient DNA studies, of isotopic analyses. But we can do this and start asking different kinds of questions and telling different kinds of stories as we reassemble these complex, varied, and very different past worlds. Thanks very much for listening.